When Paul and I recorded this podcast yesterday, the whereabouts of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner group, was a little bit up in the air. He was actually last seen in Africa. And we had speculated over the last month that we were surprised he was still alive, that Putin had kept him alive. This was the most serious challenge to Putin's power in the 23 years he has been in power. And Prigozhin was supposed to be exiled to Belarus. It looked like he was leading operations in Africa somewhere back to kind of his old ways. And, if there's one thing we know about Putin is he does not let his enemies live. I mean, this is just something that he, on the world stage, in front of the most important people in the world, he has executed anybody who has gone against him, essentially. And this has happened over and over and over again. And today we found out that the plane carrying the Wagner group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin was actually shot down over Moscow. Part of this is not surprising. The initial reports do confirm that Prigozhin was on the plane. This is a man who is known as Putin's chef for multiple decades, executing some of the craziest orders that Putin put out. But now, as far as we know, he is dead. And this is just more consolidation of power by Vladimir Putin. Me and Paul are going to talk about this in much more detail coming up, but I did want to add that context as a preview to this coming discussion right now, because when we did this yesterday, all of this had not happened yet. Hi, Paul. It's been over a month since we last spoke, and since we last spoke, Russia was in a very precarious position, or rather, Vladimir Putin seemed to be in a very precarious position. His power was being challenged by Prigozhin. First of all, do we even know where Prigozhin is right now? Have we gotten an update on what this guy is doing right now?
We don't know exactly where he is, but he just released a video, I think yesterday or maybe today, talking about Africa and about the Wagner group as helping bring freedom to Africa, which is pretty hilarious. The chutzpah of it. Freedom in the sense of freedom for Africa's dictators to do whatever they want.
I was about to say the Wagner group has been hired by African dictators to fight proxy wars on their behalf, essentially, right? They're this Black Ops
basically,
army.
these guys are in power. There have been a lot of coups in Africa. Some of these militaries that have taken over in coups are themselves very weak, so they need some help staying in power. And compared to the average African government, the Wagner group can bring a lot of weaponry and very highly trained troops to bear on a problem.
So Prigozhin is back to his old ways, and I can say we're probably both surprised that he's still alive at this point, that Putin hasn't taken him out. So that could only mean that he probably has some use for Putin at some point.
Well, it's hard to say. There are also some signs that the Russian Ministry of Defense is trying to ace the Wagner group out of these missions in Africa. So there's kind of a good old fashioned, I think, mafia battle kind of over who's going to have the turf in Africa to basically, to continue the mafia analogy, to make money off what's a protection racket for African non-democratic leaders.
I mean, that is a good analogy. We have called, Russia as the largest organized crime syndicate in the world, probably ever in history, in fact. So this is essentially what's taking place. So that being said, what has happened over the past month with Putin, with Russia, and with Ukraine's objectives here during this war?
Yeah, so the progress, the big news of the summer is this Ukrainian offensive, primarily heading southwards towards the Black Sea to try to cut Russian forces in Ukraine in half. And it's been going very slowly. And so there's kind of two interpretations out there. One is it's going very slowly, and this sort of tells you that the Ukrainians really aren't going to achieve what they want. And, maybe it's time to start thinking about a peace deal, right? Despite the fact that the Russians still have said no, they've given no indication that they're interested in a peace deal. The other interpretation is, it's going slowly, but that's how these things go, given how deeply and how well entrenched the Russian forces are. and that it wasn't realistic to expect a rapid breakthrough. And so the fact that it's gone slowly is not necessarily as negative as some people make it seem, and that if Ukraine can continue to do what they're doing, they will eventually cut the Russian forces in Ukraine in half. And that will be a massive logistical problem then for Russia.
Mm-hmm. But it kind of comes back to the former thesis that you've laid out, is that this is likely almost going to be like a stalemate, potentially for years on end, even,
I
right?
think that's right. Even if Ukraine can achieve its mission in this offensive, and that would be a fairly different strategic situation. The further it goes on, for one side to take territory from the other is going to get harder and harder.
Mm-hmm.
And, what's going on in southern Ukraine kind of shows why. The Russians have been there for a year, and they use that year to dig trenches, to lay minefields, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So once somebody occupies the territory for a while, it can become very difficult to take it back.
Mm-hmm. So Ukraine, they've launched this offensive. It's not going as planned as it seems. So what do you actually see on the horizon at this point? Is there any changes in the power structure in Russia, for instance, from the coup and everything that's happened, or are things just back to the way they were?
Well, I think there's probably a lot going on beneath the surface, but Putin is still in power. There's no signs that of sort of aftershocks from this Prigozhin march on Moscow, coup attempt, whatever you want to call it. That being said, there was one Russian commander who said earlier this week, or maybe it was late last week, said maybe this is a good time for a ceasefire, and we can wait for a while, and then maybe go back at it later.
Do you anticipate that happening?
I don't, although I do think it would be very smart for Russia to do.
To
Right?
do a ceasefire.
Russia could declare a ceasefire, wait 4 or 5, or one scenario would be Russia declares a ceasefire, waits 5 years till the Western unity decreases, right? Until the West turns its attention to other things, and then just does it again.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the flip side of that, let me just give you the flip side, is that if there's a ceasefire and Ukraine uses the next 5 years to dig trenches and lay minefields and supply itself with Western weapons, it will be very, very difficult for Russia to then, and very
Mm-hmm.
costly for Russia to attack again. So, to a large extent, whether a ceasefire makes sense to Russia depends immensely on what Russia's real objectives are.
Mm-hmm.
If Russia is happy keeping the territory it has taken, then it makes all the sense in the world to have a ceasefire.
Mm-hmm. Is the real objectives at this point, though, for Putin to save face and kind of come out of this hole again?
Well, I think part of it is for Putin to save face, and he wants more of a victory than the one he's got. I think there's also a very good case to be made that for Putin personally, this war has, in a lot of ways, helped get Russia to be more of the Russian he wants it to be. Right? This war has helped him essentially raise the level of authoritarianism in Russia to much, much higher levels, to solidify his control to much, much higher levels. And so he might decide that a state of war is actually good for the kind of Russia he wants to see.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it might be good for him and his power structure, but part of the worry here, and part of the worry for Ukraine, must be the support from the West, right? Like what is going to, for this war to continue? And
Absolutely.
I know the rhetoric is now ramping up. What I mean is, I'm starting to hear presidential candidates, and I'm start using some certain pieces of language about support for Ukraine, how long we can keep it going, and so as the election comes forward. Like speak to that. Like what do you foresee happening? Because what the West does and what the U.S. does very much hinges on who becomes our next president. So what do you see happening here, for instance?
Are you asking me to predict who's going to win next year's presidential election?
Well, why don't we get a little bit political? Let's make it interesting and say, okay, first of all, let's say and I assume there's one scenario with Trump, okay? But let's
Yep.
say you have these other two candidates. Okay, you have DeSantis, and then you have I think is a Vivek Ramaswamy is another candidate, and then you have some other candidates there. But let's just take a more moderate position
Okay.
than Trump, which is a more extreme, I would say. But even though
Yep.
he is a front runner for the Republican Party, but
Yep.
what do you anticipate happening with someone like DeSantis or Ramaswamy?
Yeah. So DeSantis and Ramaswamy will find that there's a lot of stuff that it's really easy to say on the campaign trail, right? But it's a lot harder to do in practice.
This is what Barack Obama found when he became president. And there's a lot of great ways to make promises. I'm going to close down Guantanamo. I'm going to do all these things. Once you face all the facts, reality changes completely, right?
You nailed it. You nailed it. You nailed it. Donald Trump came to power in January 2017, pretty determined, I think, to get us out of Afghanistan, right? He didn't do it. Joe Biden did do it, and Biden took it on the chin for doing it, right? In part because let's be honest, the execution was pretty
disastrous.
terrible.
It was completely disastrous.
Which again is more about the folks who got us in there than about Joe Biden, right? And I'm not here to defend Joe Biden. I'm only here to say you can't really blame him for the military's execution of things. Donald Trump, he was, in 20 what year was it? I guess it was what was the exactly? I'm trying to think. It must have been 2019 when he was busy trying to sort of get the Ukrainian president to open an investigation against Hunter Biden, right?
Mm-hmm.
And is basically saying to the Ukrainians, "We're not going to, give you any of this aid that Congress has already allocated if you don't help me politically." So he was pretty anti-Ukrainian, and he seems very pro-Putin. But he was the guy, not Barack Obama, that actually shipped the Javelin missiles to Ukraine. That became very, very important when the Russians tanks rolled in, and
Trump was the guy. Trump shipped the very okay, interesting. Yeah.
So my point is that and as much as I'm not here to praise Joe Biden, nor am I here to praise Donald Trump, but my point is what people say on the campaign trail and what they do as president is not always identical. And partly it's because they're extraordinarily cynical, opportunistic human beings, right? You don't get to be president of the United States without telling people what they want to hear. Let's put it that way. But to be a little bit more generous to them, you do have a different view of it's much easier to criticize when you don't have the guns, when you don't have your finger on the trigger.
Mm-hmm.
We see this over and over and over again. So that's why it's not entirely clear to me that these campaign statements are the best indication of who will throw Ukraine under the bus when the time comes. If I were to get my sense is that Ramaswamy is more committed to helping Russia than DeSantis is.
Helping
Russia so much, I can't figure out.
He's trying to help Russia, you're saying.
Well, if you force Ukraine to lose the war, you're helping Russia, right? And that seems to be what he's committed to. Sorry, I'm being a little bit harsh.
And I'm saying, but the broader, he would say that he just wants to get a peace brokered, and he wants this war to end, and he wants us to stop sending supplies to Ukraine, though, right?
If you stop sending supplies to Ukraine and then broker the peace, then Russia gets what it wants.
Yeah.
And again, this is the difference between being on the campaign trail and being president, which is on the campaign trail, he can pretend there's a magic solution. Right? Which is, we're going to get peace and it's going to look pretty okay. Right? When he becomes president, he's got to deal with Putin. Right?
Well, his major interest becomes the U.S. interest, right? He has to, whatever is going to elevate U.S. interests. And I don't think Russia is interested in U.S. interests. They're not an ally or anything else like that. So I would assume presented with the appropriate information, whether it's DeSantis, whether it's Ramaswamy, it could just be business as usual. It could the war could go on, and we could continue providing support to Ukraine based on the intelligence and everything else that these candidates are getting once they're in office. Is that fair to say?
Well, yeah, and because it's easier for him to say, it's easy to say Biden should stop sending Ukraine weapons, because when he does that and the Russian tanks roll into Kiev, he will turn around in the next breath, like any good opposition politician would do, and blame Biden for losing Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
When he's the one that's going to get blamed for the Russian tanks rolling into Kiev, he'll have a different perspective on it.
Mm-hmm.
That's
No,
my guess.
that makes sense in the current light of politics in
Yep.
America. So, bottom line here is they could be saying one thing, but at the end of the day, what all Americans need to understand is there is a reason the United States is supplying resources to Ukraine,
Yeah.
and there's long-term objectives here. And not only is it what's potentially right for the Ukrainian people, but also U.S. interests are also being taken into consideration here, right?
Yeah, I mean, you know where I stand on this. To me, this is a great bargain. Unlike the war in Iraq or the war in Afghanistan, this one does not involve American kids getting killed,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
That's the kind of war we should like, is the one that doesn't get any of our kids killed. And the
Yeah.
Ukrainians are very happy to get their kids killed because they're fighting for their land.
Mm-hmm.
So to me,
Mm-hmm.
and I understand different people have different perspectives. And I understand people are worried that about getting drawn in, about mission creep, a la Vietnam / Iraq / Afghanistan. I think those are valid and realistic concerns. I think those concerns are manageable,
Well,
but
just to play devil's, I mean, I think the
sure.
realistic concerns are that we are potentially escalating this war when the resolution is already there, and it could just go on for years, and we could potentially be putting Russia in a situation where nuclear arms then come on the table, or there's a power vacuum in Russia, with no Putin, which could even be a worst case scenario potentially, right? So there are some legitimate concerns here that I think people are bringing up, at least to the way I understand it. But I mean, like speak on those concerns, though.
Yeah, I mean, we can imagine a lot of bad things happening, right? Which is more likely, that a Russia that is confronted using nuclear weapons, or that a Russia that is not confronted ends up going somewhere where we feel like we've got to do a lot more than just sending some stuff,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So the thesis there would be that Russia has to be confronted at one point, and now it's
well, so
happening this way.
I think this is really I think the real difference between the sort of, hawks and doves on Russia is different assumptions about what Russia will do if left alone, right? The Ramaswamis of the world and the John Mearsheimers, because they blame us for doing this in the first place, they have this idea that if we just leave Russia alone, right, Russia will
I mean, it all
uh,
had to do with NATO. NATO was the
right,
reason that Russia
right.
attacked Ukraine. This is the argument.
I think that's spectacularly naive, right? Um, Russia spans 11 time zone. It's by far the largest country in the world in terms of land area. It doesn't need more land, and yet there it is invading Ukraine. If Russia's 11 time zones don't make it safe territorially, then nothing is going to do it, other than maybe eventually getting to the coast of Portugal.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea that Russia, for every other country in the world has a better case to make that it needs some kind of buffer zone than Russia. And yet Russia is the one invading its neighbor. So it's not about buffer zones. It's about Russia has this imperial story it tells itself. And it's not going to stop trying to expand. It's just going to be stopped from expanding.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I hate to
Okay.
say it, because I didn't really think that was true for a long time, but to me, the evidence kind of is overwhelming.
And I just want to make the point. I mean, once again, you've written a book on this topic. You have studied this deeply for
Yep.
multiple decades. Most people are coming at this from very surface level understanding. And obviously, there's other scholars in this that you have differing opinions from. John Mearsheimer
Right.
is one of them,
Yep.
but he's not mainstream in this scenario. He is
No,
not.
has nor has he spent any time at all studying Russia-Ukraine relations.
Yeah, I don't think there's a single really kind of scholar who's really studied these things who's not agreeing with kind of Ukraine's actions as opposed to Russia's in this scenario.
To be fair, there are some.
Okay.
There are some. I tend to strenuously disagree with them.
Uh-huh.
But it is exactly that. There are scholars and that basically think that Russia's defensive, and it's all about NATO expansion.
Okay. Well, we've had this conversation before,
Yep.
and I'm glad we just kind of brought it up again because this is what
Yep.
the American public is actually going to hear over the next probably a
Yep.
year or so as we get into election season.
Yep.
But we'll continue talking about this, and we're going to continue our conversation in just a moment.
Okay.
Um,